how does a guy who, successfully mastered Chinese, French, and Spanish completely fail when trying to learn Italian, Malay, and Japanese?
Yeah.
Welcome to today's deep dive.
It's a pretty wild contrast, honestly.
Right, it really is. I mean, we are looking at a transcript today from a YouTube presentation by a gentleman named Keith. He runs a channel called English Speaking Success,
Yeah.
and he's a 20-year veteran of language learning and teaching.
Yeah, he really knows his stuff.
Exactly. And that opening contradiction I mentioned, that is the entire mission of our analysis today. We're looking at someone who clearly has the intellectual capacity and this proven methodology to acquire incredibly difficult skills, but he still finds himself occasionally just hitting a brick wall.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because this isn't just about learning a language, is it?
No, not at all. It's about decoding the underlying architecture of why we succeed at some massive undertakings in our lives, but then, we completely abandon others halfway through.
Yeah, which happens to all of us. Right. It forces us to confront this very uncomfortable truth about skill acquisition. Like, we have this tendency to credit our successes to our own hard work. But then we turn around and blame our failures on a lack of innate talent or maybe environmental factors.
Oh, for sure. Like, I'm just not good at math or whatever.
Exactly. But Keith's experience totally shatters that illusion. You cannot be naturally gifted at Spanish, but somehow genetically incapable of learning Italian.
That makes no sense.
Right, it doesn't. The reality of how we acquire complex skills is entirely structural. When Keith succeeded, he applied a specific, even if it was sometimes unconscious system. And when he failed, the system broke down at one of several, critical stress points.
So where did it break down for Italian?
Well, the very first point of failure, that foundational crack in his Italian journey, was a complete loss of environmental control and prioritization.
Ah, okay. Yeah, in the source, he introduces this visual of putting your blinkers on, which I thought was a great analogy.
It's super effective.
Yeah, if you picture a racehorse, trainers put those letter blinders or blinkers on the sides of the horse's eyes, so the animal can literally only see the track directly ahead.
Right, it physically cannot see the crowds.
Exactly. Or the other horses or any of those peripheral distractions. Keith argues that this hyper-focused, distraction-free environment is like the mandatory first step of the system.
And he has this brilliant real-world anecdote that illustrates exactly what happens when those blinkers are taken off. So Keith spent 2 months living in Italy. Specifically, he was teaching English to the Italian police force.
Oh, wow. Talk about an intense environment.
Totally. During that time, he was entirely immersed. His environment essentially forced the blinkers onto him.
Yeah.
He was picking up the language rapidly, navigating coffee shops, interacting with locals. The ecosystem basically demanded his focus.
But then he went home.
Right. The critical failure occurred when those 2 months ended and he returned home.
Because the environment changed and the structure just collapsed. I mean, he kept practicing for the first week or two, I think he said, but everyday life inevitably crept back in.
Yeah, the distractions returned.
And his immediate justification for abandoning the language was that classic default we all use, the old, I just don't have time.
Which is such a common trap. But what's fascinating here is how Keith later analyzed his own mindset shift. He came to realize that the phrase, I don't have time, is essentially a semantic shield.
A semantic shield, I like that.
Yeah, it's a psychological defense mechanism designed to protect our ego. We really don't want to admit that we are just giving up, so we blame this external, uncontrollable force, the clock.
Right.
But Keith trained himself to forcefully replace I don't have time with the phrase, I choose not to do this.
Oof. That is harsh. But that semantic shift completely rewires the accountability structure because, I mean, the phrase, I don't have time, is a total illusion. Time operates exactly like a financial budget.
Oh, that's a really good way to look at it.
Right. You have 24 hours in a day, just like you have a finite number of dollars in a bank account. You don't mysteriously run out of time. You simply allocate your budget to other expenses.
Exactly.
So when you force yourself to say, I choose not to study right now, you are audibly admitting that whatever you're doing instead, whether that's scrolling on your phone or watching a movie or, even doing extra work at the office, is a higher priority to you in that exact moment than your stated goal.
Which strips away the victim mentality entirely. You are no longer at the mercy of some busy schedule. You're the sole architect of your daily choices.
Yeah, you own it.
And acknowledging that you are in control of that time budget forces you to confront the next major barrier, which is managing your expectations about the actual cost of the project.
Mm-hmm.
If you set your daily budget based on wildly inaccurate pricing,
Yeah.
you are going to go bankrupt emotionally and intellectual.
Which happens constantly
Yeah.
because the language learning market is just flooded with terrible data.
Oh, it's everywhere.
A quick search on social media yields thousands of influencers looking directly into the camera, promising fluency in 3 months. Or claiming you can master a language by learning just 5 words a day for 10 minutes.
It's so misleading.
It creates this wildly distorted reality for the learner. It basically sets them up for inevitable failure when they hit, like, month 4 and still can't hold a basic conversation.
Yeah, Keith aggressively counters that social media mythology by looking at hard institutional data. He points to Cambridge English metrics, which actually track the reality of linguistic progression.
And what do they say?
Well, according to their data, moving up just one single proficiency band, so for example, going from a B1 intermediate level to a B2 upper intermediate level, requires roughly 200 hours of guided study.
Wow. Wait, 200 hours just for one band.
Just one band.
If we break that map down, a learner dedicating a solid, highly focused hour of study 5 days a week in and week out, is looking at nearly 10 months of consistent work just to move up one single level.
Yep, almost a year.
That completely exposes the influencer model. But it also highlights this huge conflict of interest at play. Content creators have one eye on education, but the other eye is securely locked on engagement algorithms.
Right. They need views.
Exactly. Telling an audience that they need a year of grinding, unglamorous effort. That does not generate viral traction.
Not at all. And the danger of those false timelines is the psychological friction they create. When a learner believes the process should take 3 months and then they hit that 100-hour mark, what linguists often call the intermediate plateau, the novelty of the new language wears off.
Ah, the honeymoon phase ends.
Exactly. The brain stops getting those cheap dopamine hits that come with learning basic vocabulary like colors and numbers. And the progress visually slows down. If they believe they should be fluent by now, they just quit.
Because they think they're failing.
Right. But acknowledging the 200-hour reality prepares the learner for a marathon, not a sprint. And as Keith points out, the only viable way to survive a 200-hour marathon is to ruthlessly curate study materials that you genuinely enjoy.
That makes sense.
If the textbook bores you, it becomes a friction point, and you will eventually stop choosing to allocate your time budget to it.
It seems to me, though, the real danger of that 200-hour timeline isn't just the intellectual difficulty of the material, it's the inevitable drop in momentum.
Yeah, staying motivated is huge.
Pushing through that 100-hour plateau requires a massive, sustained energy source. It's a lot like a car battery in a freezing climate.
Okay, how so?
Well, the battery naturally drains on its own just by existing in the cold. It requires a constant, active trickle charge to remain operational. If you aren't actively charging it, the engine simply won't turn over. Keith actually refers to this charge as your mojo, or your motivation.
I love that. Your mojo.
Yeah.
And the most potent trickle charge for your motivation is having a deeply resonant why. When you are grinding through month 5 and the grammar just feels impenetrable, you need an emotional tether to the original goal.
Give me an example.
Well, Keith uses the example of an English learner studying for the IELTS exam. Nobody's true. Intrinsic motivation is to pass a standardized test.
Right, tests are awful.
The test is just a hurdle. The actual why is the desire to study abroad, or maybe the ambition to move a family to a new country for a fundamentally better life, that emotional core is what actually charges the battery.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. A strong emotional core. Why isn't enough to carry you through if the goal itself is structurally flawed?
What do you mean by structurally flawed?
Well, Keith points out that the vast majority of learners set really abstract goals. They say things like, I want to be fluent, but fluency is an incredibly vague concept.
It really is.
It gives the brain no actionable direction and, more importantly, no feedback loop. The brain craves progress markers, right? And if it can't measure its own progress, it interprets all that continued effort as just wasted energy.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
This is exactly why Keith leans heavily into the framework of SMART goals.
Yeah.
Specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. So saying, I want to be fluent is entirely unmeasurable. A structurally sound goal sounds more like, I want to be able to confidently communicate my ideas on common daily topics, like my job and my hobbies, within the next 6 months.
Because you can actually test that. At the 6-month mark, you can literally sit down and attempt to explain your job in the target language. You will have a definitive metric of success or failure.
Precisely. And feeding that motivation, hitting those specific metrics, often requires a shift in how we view our environment, too. Keith shares this very revealing story about his time learning Spanish.
Oh, the Madrid story?
Yes. So he was living in Madrid for a year, completely surrounded by the language, yet he made the deliberate decision to enroll in a formal Spanish class.
Which his roommate actually thought he was crazy for doing.
Yeah,
The roommate's logic was, we live in Madrid. The whole city is a classroom. Just walk outside and talk to people on the street. And I mean, on the surface, that makes perfect sense. Why pay for a class when you have total immersion right outside your door?
because Keith recognized a critical limitation in those street interactions. Buying coffee or asking for directions in a grocery store, those are purely transactional exchanges.
Right, you just point and pay.
Yeah, you are using the exact same limited, predictable phrasing every single day. There's no depth. But when Keith took the class, his proficiency accelerated dramatically.
Because of the grammar drills.
Actually, no. The underlying psychology here wasn't just about accessing a wider vocabulary or strict grammar instruction. The classroom provided a shared struggle.
Oh, interesting.
It connected him with a community of other adult learners who were facing the exact same cognitive frustrations. The camaraderie of that shared environment fed his motivation in a way that those brief transactional encounters on the street never could.
Wow, okay. So, we have an accountability of time, a realistic 200-hour timeline, a strong emotional why, and highly specific goals. But even with all that structure, looking at a multi-year project can be paralyzing.
It's incredibly daunting.
If a learner's goal is 6 months or a year away, how do they look at that mountain of work without the sheer scale of it generating crippling anxiety?
Well, you have to manipulate your own perspective. Keith introduces this analogy of mountain rambling or hiking. If you're standing at the base of a mountain and the guide tells you that you're about to endure a grueling 10-kilometer hike with massive elevation gains, your brain immediately calculates the gap between your current state and the finish line.
And that massive gap generates exhaustion before you've even taken a single step.
Right, exactly.
The scale of the endeavor becomes an obstacle in itself.
But if the guide changes the framing and says, hey, first, we're just going to hike up to that small ridge right there. Then we'll rest and walk down to the lake. After that, we'll head toward the village. Suddenly, the objective feels entirely manageable.
Because the brain only has to calculate the energy required for the next immediate milestone.
Yes. And Keith applied this exact micro-milestone philosophy to learning Chinese, which presents a notoriously steep learning curve for English speakers.
Oh, for sure.
He didn't focus on fluency. He mapped out a 3-year progression. Year 1 was solely focused on communicating with family and friends. Year 2 expanded to deeper, more complex conversations in the community. And then Year 3 was dedicated to achieving a professional proficiency to actually work in a Chinese environment.
And looking at how he executed that year 1 goal is really the key here. He didn't try to cram. He attended a class for an hour and a half every single morning at 8 a.m. before work for 8 straight months.
Talk about discipline.
Right. And that relentless small daily step eventually got him to an A2 conversational level. The psychological insight here is profound, I think. Living constantly in the future, obsessing over the ultimate goal of fluency, pulls you out of the necessary work.
It really does.
It generates anxiety because you are focused on what you cannot yet do. Breaking the goal down into daily microtasks forces you to anchor yourself entirely in the present moment.
If we connect this to the bigger picture of cognitive focus, small steps are a grounding mechanism. You aren't worrying about the thousands of words you don't know yet. You're solely focused on understanding the vocabulary for the weather today. You engage completely with the now.
But being present in the now only works if the mechanism of study is actually effective.
That's a huge caveat.
And this leads to what Keith considers his greatest academic failure. He studied French for 10 years in the school system, a full decade of reading textbooks, analyzing grammar rules, and completing passive listening exercises.
10 years.
10 years. Yet at age 18, he arrived at the end of that decade completely unable to hold a functional conversation in French.
It is the ultimate trap of passive study. We so often confuse the collection of data with the acquisition of a skill.
So what does this all mean? If we map this onto physical fitness, passive study is the equivalent of watching 10 years of workout videos.
No, it is a perfect comparison.
Yeah. You can memorize the names of every muscle group. You can study the biomechanics of a perfect deadlift. But if you never actually pick up a heavy barbell, your muscles will not grow.
Exactly.
The human brain operates on a very similar principle. You cannot build the neural pathways required for spontaneous speech simply by observing the language. You have to put the cognitive muscle under tension.
You are distinguishing between passive knowledge and active competence here.
Mm.
Knowing the theoretical rules of how a language operates is a completely different neurological process than dynamically retrieving and using those words in real time.
Right.
Keith's core directive here is that active practice must occur simultaneously with study. You cannot study grammar for a year and then decide it is time to start speaking.
Doesn't work that way.
No. The brain requires the friction of application.
Right.
As you learn a rule today, you must physically speak it out loud today. You must manipulate the phrasing, write it down in a new context, or use it in an online conversation. The language must immediately transition from academic trivia into a functional tool.
Because active recall forces the brain to strengthen the synaptic connections. It essentially proves to your brain that the information is necessary for survival.
Spot on.
So you do the work, you put the cognitive muscle under tension, and you have a highly productive, active study session today. But the immediate problem is that the brain is incredibly leaky. You build the muscle today, but without intervention, the muscle rapidly atrophies by tomorrow.
Yeah, this is the phenomenon known as the forgetting curve, which was pioneered by psychologist Hermann Ebbinghaus.
Oh, this part blew my mind.
It's wild. Ebbinghaus mapped out the terrifying velocity at which the human brain discards newly acquired information. According to his research, if you learn something new today and you do not systematically review it, you can lose up to 70% of that data within 24 hours.
70%. You spend a highly focused hour studying, and the next day your brain has essentially deleted 42 minutes of that effort.
It's brutal. But to understand why, you have to look at the brain as a biological efficiency engine. The brain consumes a massive amount of our daily caloric energy. So to conserve power, it aggressively prunes any neural pathways that it deems non-essential.
It's just trying to save energy.
Right. If you encounter a new word once, the brain categorizes it as trivial data and deletes it. This is why spaced repetition is critical. By reviewing the material at increasing intervals, so the next day, then 3 days later, then a week later, you interrupt the forgetting curve.
Like what apps like Duolingo try to do.
Exactly. You are repeatedly signaling to the brain that this information is essential, forcing it to stop the pruning process and encode the data into long-term memory.
And this brings us to Keith's specific methodology for reviewing, which is honestly my favorite takeaway, because it completely redefines how we should interrupt that curve.
Yeah, his approach is really unique.
He doesn't just stare at the same flashcards over and over. If he takes a class, he will review his handwritten notes a few hours later to solidify the short-term memory. But when he reviews a day or two later, he refuses to just reread those identical notes.
So what does he do?
Instead, he consumes native media on the exact same topic. So if he studied weather vocabulary on Tuesday, he doesn't look at his vocabulary list on Thursday. He goes on YouTube and watches a French weather report or maybe a documentary about a hurricane.
This raises an important question about the limitations of rote memorization. Staring at a list of words creates a very narrow, fragile neural pathway. But Keith's method of recycling the language is structurally superior because it forces geographic encoding in the brain.
Geographic encoding.
Yeah, by encountering the same vocabulary embedded in new, dynamic contexts, you're engaging the visual cortex, the auditory cortex, and emotional centers. You're building multiple interconnected pathways to the exact same piece of information.
Ah, I see.
It transitions the knowledge from a sterile academic environment into organic, real-world recognition.
It proves to the brain that this isn't just data for a test. It's a living tool required to understand the world.
Exactly.
Well, if we pull all of this together, Keith's 20-year journey, his mastery of Chinese and Spanish, and his collapse in Italian, proves that massive achievements aren't dictated by some innate mystical talent.
Not at all.
It is a calculated architecture. You have to take accountability for your time budget and force the blinkers on. You have to accept the reality of a 200-hour marathon and charge your motivation with a deeply emotional why.
Yep.
You have to break abstract goals into measurable daily microsteps to prevent psychological paralysis.
Yep.
And you must actively practice and geographically recycle your knowledge so your brain's efficiency engine doesn't just prune it all away.
The beauty of this system is that it demystifies the entire process of mastery. Success is simply the natural byproduct of applying the right structural mechanics.
It really is.
But it does leave us with a deeply provocative question to consider long after this deep dive ends.
We'll lay it on us.
Well, We explored Keith's foundational mindset shift, right? The realization that changing the phrase, "I don't have time," to the brutally accountable, "I choose not to do this," was the catalyst that unlocked his potential.
Right.
If a simple semantic shield is powerful enough to entirely derail the acquisition of a language, what other massive goals in your life right now are being held hostage by that exact same linguistic illusion?
Wow.
Whether we are talking about a pivot in your career trajectory, the depth of your personal relationships, or your physical health, the moment you realize you aren't running out of time, you realize you have always been holding the pen to your own story.